The tributes were still running. The condolence messages were still coming in from viewers around the world who had spent decades watching Joni Lamb on their televisions. People in living rooms and nursing homes and church fellowship halls who had built their mornings around the face on the screen. Daystar was still airing memorial content. Friends were still posting photographs. The Christian broadcasting world was still processing the reality that one of its most recognizable figures was suddenly, genuinely, permanently gone. And then, less than 3 weeks after Joni Lamb's death on May 7, 2026, Rachel Lamb Brown reportedly walked into a courthouse in Fort Worth, Texas. Not months down the road. Not after a quiet family meeting where everyone sat together and agreed on how to proceed. Not after a formal grieving period or a respectful interval. Within weeks of the funeral. That single fact, the speed of the legal action, immediately reframed the story for thousands of people who had been watching this family for years. Because when people rush to courts in the immediate aftermath of a death, the reason is almost always the same: something is being contested. Something is in dispute. Something could not wait. The filing Rachel submitted is formally titled an application for probate of will and issuance of letters testamentary. In plain terms, it is a request to a Texas court to recognize a specific will as legally valid and to formally appoint Rachel as the independent executor of the estate, the person legally responsible for administering everything Joni left behind. The estate itself, as described in the filing, consists of personal property, cash, personal effects, and household goods valued in excess of $10 million. That valuation reflects what remained in personal assets at the time of filing, separate from the properties already moved into the trust Rachel now administers as trustee. The trust was established on March 11, 2026, just 8 weeks before Joni died. The will was made self-proved, meaning the witnesses executed sworn affidavits at the time of signing confirming its validity, so no additional testimony is required for it to be admitted to probate. The witnesses were Arnold Torres, Daystar's chief financial officer, and a woman named Michelle Martinez. The will was notarized by Rose Martinez. None of these people are strangers to the inner workings of the ministry. But here is what has caught the attention of almost everyone following this story closely. Reports suggest that more than one version of Joni Lamb's will may have been submitted to the court. Not one document reflecting a clear, uncontested final wish. Potentially two, an earlier will and a newer one, each representing a different period in Joni's life and, presumably, a different set of instructions about what should happen after her death. When two wills exist, the legal and human questions multiply immediately. Which document is the most recent? Which one was signed under circumstances that were free from undue influence? Which one reflects what the person actually wanted in their final, clearest, most deliberate state of mind? And most critically, what changed between them? To understand why this estate dispute carries the weight it does, you have to understand the full scope of what Joni Lamb had accumulated by the end of her life, and how that accumulation happened. When Marcus Lamb died in November of 2021, Joni assumed the presidency of Daystar and her salary jumped by approximately 140%. According to an internal Daystar compensation document obtained and reported by the Roy's report, Joni's total compensation in 2021, while Marcus was still alive, was $436,750. In 2022, following Marcus's death and her assumption of the presidency, her total compensation climbed to $1,048,200. That made her salary more than 3 times higher than the next highest paid Daystar employee, who was CFO Arnold Torres at $300,000. Jonathan Lamb told investigators that his father had specifically directed that upon his death, Joni should receive a combined salary incorporating both of their previous compensation. Marcus had built that provision into the plan before he died. He intended to take care of her financially, and the organization honored that intention. But the result was a more than doubling of the total family compensation structure at a time when the ministry was also navigating the loss of its founder. The internal document also revealed that the entire immediate Lamb family was drawing nearly $2 million collectively from Daystar in 2022. Joni's oldest daughter, Rachel Lamb Brown, was receiving $190,000 annually as Director of Communications. Her husband, Josh Brown, was receiving $100,000 as a producer. Jonathan was the third highest paid employee at $199,000, $100,000 less than CFO Torres. Susie Lamb, who co-hosted The Green Room alongside Jonathan, was earning $90,000, the lowest salary of any Lamb family member. Rebecca Lamb Weiss received $100,000, and her husband Jonathan Weiss drew $185,000 for his role as Israel Liaison and Estate Planning Director. And then Doug Weiss married Joni in June of 2023. According to Jonathan, Doug began receiving a six-figure salary from Daystar almost immediately after the wedding, listed officially as a consultant. Beyond salaries, there was the real estate. In March of 2025, the Trinity Foundation and the Roy's report jointly revealed that Joni owned 7 residential properties across 4 states with a combined estimated value of approximately $11.7 million. These included her primary Colleyville, Texas residence, which the Tarrant County Appraisal District valued at $5,779,000 for the years 2024 through 2026. There was the $2.9 million Gulfront condominium in Miramar Beach, Florida, that she and Doug purchased together in September of 2023. There were additional properties in South Carolina, Georgia, and Granbury, Texas. Daystar's ministry jet made 24 round-trip flights between Fort Worth and Colorado Springs, Colorado, where Doug Weiss lived, between October of 2022 and May of 2024, at an estimated total cost of $769,000. According to the Trinity Foundation's analysis. These are the assets, the salaries, and the financial footprint at the center of this estate. That is what the courthouse filing in Fort Worth is ultimately about. In the 12 months before she died, Joni made a series of deliberate financial moves that, viewed in retrospect, read like a woman preparing for the end. She sold 3 of her properties, the Colleyville residence, her Taylor's, South Carolina home, and the Granbury Lake house. She placed 4 remaining properties into a revocable trust. And in March of 2026, just 8 weeks before her death, she signed a quiet claim deed removing Doug Weiss's name from the $2.9 million Florida Beach condo and transferring it entirely into her private trust. That last action is significant in ways that go beyond its dollar value. Joni and Doug had purchased that property together as a married couple. It represented a joint marital asset. And then, quietly and legally, she moved it out of any arrangement that included him and placed it solely under the control of her own trust structure, with Rachel as trustee. At roughly the same time, a family friend was relaying a message from board member Tom Callender suggesting that Joni had told him, in a meeting approximately 3 weeks before she died, that if Jonathan ever reached out for reconciliation he should be given back Daystar. Whether that sentiment was ever reflected anywhere in the legal documents she signed is a question the probate process may eventually have to address. But this is where the 2 wills question becomes most pointed. If Joni executed a newer will, one that reflected the legal restructuring she was undertaking in those final months, including the removal of Doug from the Florida property and the establishment of the March Trust, what exactly does that newer document say? Does it differ materially from the version Rachel filed with the court? Does it alter the distribution of assets, the identity of beneficiaries, or the scope of Rachel's authority as executor and trustee? Nobody outside the immediate legal process knows for certain. What is known is that people generally do not contest estate documents unless something inside them diverges from what was expected. They go to court when there is confusion. They go to court when a document alters an understood arrangement. They go to court when what is written on paper does not match what the person who signed it was believed to have wanted. None of this exists in isolation. It is not simply a legal dispute about property and trusts and executor authority. It is the legal expression of fractures that had been building inside this family for years, fractures that became visible to the public after Marcus died and that never fully healed before Joni followed him. Marcus Lamb's death in November of 2021 changed everything. He had been the figure at the center of both the ministry and the family. The founder, the patriarch, the man whose vision had driven the enterprise from its beginning. His succession plan had named Jonathan as the next in line after Joni. That was documented, communicated to the board, and understood within the inner circle. But within weeks of Marcus's death, internal dynamics shifted. Joni's salary more than doubled. The compensation structure expanded. And when Joni began her relationship with Doug Weiss in the summer of 2022, less than a year after burying her husband, the seeds of the conflict that eventually consumed the family were already being planted. The children's concerns about the marriage. The private objections Jonathan raised through proper channels. The financial decisions he questioned in documented internal meetings. The abuse allegations. The salary documents. The honeymoon expenses. The NDA demands. The firing. Each one of those events is now part of the context in which a Fort Worth courthouse is receiving competing legal filings about what a 65-year-old woman wanted done with everything she spent her life accumulating. There is a version of this story that presents it as a routine estate matter. A large estate, a prominent family, standard probate procedures. That version is not wrong as far as it goes. Legal estate administration is normal. Wills are filed. Executors are appointed. Courts review documents. This is how it works. But this story is not really about property values or trust structures or the mechanics of Texas probate law. It is about who gains control of a legacy. It is about whose vision of what Marcus and Joni Lamb built will ultimately shape the future of the organization they spent their lives creating. It is about whether the succession plan Marcus documented before he died, the one that named his son, will ever be honored. It is about whether the final wish Joni reportedly expressed to Tom Callender 3 weeks before she died will factor into anything that happens next. And it is about whether the financial transparency Jonathan raised concerns about internally, the salary that jumped to over $1 million, the $100,000 honeymoon, the 6-figure consultant arrangement for a new husband, the nearly $2 million flowing annually to the extended family, will ever receive the kind of independent, accountable scrutiny that the ministry's donors deserve. Daystar operates through a church designation with the IRS, which means it is not required to file the Form 990 tax returns that secular nonprofits and many other Christian organizations must submit. Those filings would require public disclosure of the compensation paid to its highest-paid employees. Without them, the only way the public learned about Joni's more than $1 million salary, or the family's collective $2 million annual compensation, or Doug Weiss's 6-figure consultant arrangement, was through internal documents that Jonathan preserved and eventually shared with investigators. Now Jonathan holds no formal role inside the institution. Rachel holds the formal authority over the personal estate. The board holds the formal authority over the ministry's future direction. And somewhere inside a Fort Worth courthouse, 2 versions of a dead woman's final wishes are being examined by a legal system that does not care about the decades of family history, the ministry's global reach, the donors who gave generously in faith, or the son who stood at his father's first broadcast tower and said simply, "To God be the glory." What happens in that courthouse, and what the board decides in the coming months about who leads Daystar forward, will determine whether the legacy Marcus and Joni Lamb spent 30 years building ends up in the hands of the people who protected it, or the people who benefited from it. Those are not always the same people. And in this family, they have not been for quite some time.